Okay, sir. Thank you. Good morning, all. On behalf of the Department of English, Rajnagar Mahavidyalaya, Rajnagar, Birbhum, West Bengal, this is Mahinur Khatun, welcoming you to the sixth session of the remote lecture series, Confab 2021. Today, we are very happy to have in our midst Dr. Monisha Sarkar Sinha, Assistant Professor, Department of English, East Calcutta Girls College, Lake Town, Kolkata.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Monisha Sarkar has been teaching English as an assistant professor at East Calcutta Girls College. She has done her doctoral research on romanticism in Victorian novels. She has published many research articles on literature, drama, poetry, fiction, and ecology. Her areas of interest include European drama, British Romantic literature, Victorian studies, women's writings, and literature of Northeast India. Now, today, she is going to speak on Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, that is on our undergraduate syllabus. So, without any delay, I will request our honorable speaker, Dr. Monisha Sarkar, to address us. Over to you, madam.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind introduction. And once again, I formally start by addressing respected Principal Sir, Dr. Siddhartha Bhattacharya, and Professor Mahenur Khatun, the head of the Department of English, as well as all the other respected teachers of the college, and of course, my very dear students. It is a privilege to have been invited on this online platform to deliver the lecture hosted by Rajnagar Mahavidyalaya, Birbhum. And I thank you all for giving me this opportunity to give a talk on the novel Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte. Of course, you know. So, the title of my lecture today will be Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Ecology. Right at the beginning, I think I would like to tell you that it's been quite some time since I visited Jane Eyre. So there might be certain hiccups. I hope you'll accept and keep me company throughout. So let's start. Well, today the topic of our discussion is Jane Eyre. And as you all know, it was originally published as Jane Eyre, an autobiography. It was initially published under the pseudonyms of Currer Bell. Of course, you all are aware that the Bronte sisters initially they did not publish their novels using their original names, and they published their novels under the masculine pseudonyms of Currer Bell. Charlotte, she took on the pseudonym of Currer Bell. Emily Bronte took on Ellis Bell, and Anne Bronte took on the name of Acton Bell. This was done in order to ensure their privacy and also because they wanted to concentrate with complete freedom on their writing. So today the novel that we are going to discuss is a Bildungsroman, and this follows the experience of our heroine, that is Jane Eyre. She's an orphan, and we trace her growth into adulthood and finally her culmination of her love for Mr. Rochester, the brooding master of Thornfield Hall. And we find that the novel ends with the happy marriage between Mr. Rochester and Jane Eyre. Now, coming to the other word that is there in my title, ecology. Well, you're all aware that it is the study of the ecosystem. And this is the relationship between the living organisms including humans and their physical environment. So, romantic ecology was quite popular among the Bronte sisters as it emphasized on the simulation of human mind or imagination into activity by divinely inspired forms of maternal nature. In Jane Eyre, we find that Charlotte Bronte offers an image of this orphan woman child and her environment in the Victorian world. The Victorian world, of course, we know, was the urban industrial artifice of society. This is rejected by Charlotte for the pristine state of nature, the nature which is blended with imagination. And we get the idea of returning to nature. We find, as we read the novel, the emotional climate of the child's subjective feelings, which is reflected through nature, and how it reveals Jane's awareness regarding the bond between human beings and nature. Especially when she is desolate and isolated in a solitary state, nature acts as a balm to her weary soul. In her misery, it is nature to whom Jane draws this life spirit to continue her lonely journey. Now, if we go back a little, we will find that romanticism in British literature can be considered as the beginning of serious studies in the understanding of nature in its varied aspects. This period in England, as you all know, is preceded by James Watt's inventions of the steam engine, the expansion of the railways, the setting up of the industries, the enclosure of the open fields and wastelands by the Act of Parliament, and of course the revolutions both at home and abroad. Ironically, yet historically authentic, this period, the literary historians define as romantic, witnessed both the destruction of ecology and the birth of ecological consciousness, animal rights, and of course, the return to nature movement. So there are certain scholars, and we have Timothy Morton, who states about the incident when Lord Erskine, he gave the first speech in the Parliament supporting animal rights. So during this time, nationalism also emerged, and it invoked an environing nature as a powerful image of the nation as land. So if we think of William Blake's very prophetic words, he who shall hurt the little wren shall never be beloved by men. We can easily trace a new attitude towards nature. Of course, amidst the obnoxious coal burned fumes of industrialization and the squalor of overpopulated urban slums that we find during this time, which is, of course, reflected in the novels of Dickens, Hard Times especially. But going back to the Romantics, if we take up Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, I think most of you have already gone through the poem, where the albatross emerges from the fog as an emissary from the Antarctic wilderness, and the mariner's spontaneous identification of the albatross as a Christian soul and one life provides an alternative model of nature based on pantheism. Killing that bird that loved man expresses the mariner's prideful self-sufficiency, his readiness to cut himself off from the universal community of life and love. And so naturally his punishment is to experience elected isolation in a world in which nature has become alien and inimical to him. So, this killing of the albatross, that is, in a way, destruction of nature, symbolizes the complete destruction of ecology brought upon by the Industrial Revolution, with its tall chimneys rising up into the air like competing towers of Babel. In England, Christianity primarily promoted an anthropocentric concept of the universe, where human beings commanded and ruled over plant and animal life. Nature, in spite of being a key term in Enlightenment, was relegated to the margins or used as an abstract principle, such as human nature, or the natural, or the pictorial, and nature with its flora, fauna, and various elements became just a passive backdrop for the human drama of literature. Because at that time, if you remember, the proper study of mankind was man. So, this treatment of nature in the Western societies was rooted in the productive relationships, technological imperatives, and the historically conditioned demographic trends that characterize the dominant social system of the time. So, during this time, there were works where you will find it is mentioned how the patriarchal structure of the society supported this destruction of ecology in the name of activity, progress, and development. So, implicitly justifying that through this notion of passivity, which it attributed to both the women of the time and, of course, nature. With a gradual disappearance of the cities of England into this haze of smog and transformation of the agrarian society to an industrial one, nature became more closely associated with human activity rather than being related to the inscrutable acts of the divine being. So, the idyllic romantic conception of the natural world as an area of vital sustenance and harmonious existence is juxtaposed with this nightmarish vision of the earth, which is threatened by the mills of Satan. You remember about the industrial belts of Britain's mercantile empire, which was expanding, and the scars of the railway tracks crisscrossing across the Sylvian landscape, the deployment of heavy industry in urban areas led to the debasement of the human spirit too. So, this whirlwind of sulfurous smoke from the engines, the dark satanic mills, the blackening perpetrated by the coal mines. These, if you again recall William Blake's words, they were the flames of eternal fury that cast a pall of gloom. Now, at this time, several Victorian women novelists, they responded to this ecological degradation by offering an antithetical world of pastoral romance and by making a holistic study of the natural world with the conception of the world as a harmonious, self-regulating system. So, romantic ecology emphasized on the simulation of this human mind or imagination or creativity into a kind of activity which is inspired by the divine or the maternal aspect of nature. And Charlotte Bronte, she lays emphasis on nature as a means of sustenance and peaceful coexistence. If you read the novels of Charlotte Bronte, Shirley Willett, and even The Professor, you will find evocative description of the landscape, or we can even call them word painting, which transports us to a world which is untrammeled by the artificial, where the spirit of nature reigns supreme. And Charlotte Bronte, she incorporates natural imagery and landscape portraits to blend the plot, the characters, and the theme. Here, each person is transported to a world he or she can easily identify with through the elements of nature. So, nature blends with imagination. And we find there is this idea of return to nature or naivety, which was, of course, common to both the German and English Romanticism. Of course, Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey comes to mind. The relationship between the world of human beings and the natural world is established there, highlighting the harmonious coexistence of human community with nature. Both, we know that, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they have expressed a deep and passionate interest in presenting the earth as a place where all living beings dwell in harmony. So they conceive of the earth as a household encompassing all the biological community in its fold. Now, this same can be said to be applicable to Charlotte Bronte's novels. We find Jane's intimate relationship with her environment, where her thoughts, her feelings are manifest through nature. When you read the novel, you will find that there is an intense desire in Jane to belong. And that is clear right from the beginning. She's, of course, aware of the difference between the natural world and the human world, where she is rejected time and again. I would like to draw your attention to the time in the novel when she is a young girl, a child, and she is confined to the Red Room, if you remember, as a punishment by Mrs. Reed, her guardian. And she suffers from a nervous breakdown. This is because she understands that she does not belong to this place and that she is a discord at Gateshead, since she has no entity of her own here. I think at this point, I would like to bring to your notice the ballad, very sorrowful ballad, which Bessie, the only person who was kind and considerate to Jane, she sang this ballad to soothe and calm Jane's nerves. And I would just like to go through the lines of the ballad. My feet, they are sore, and my limbs, they are weary. Long is the way, and the mountains are wild. Soon will the twilight close, moonless and dreary, over the path of the poor orphan child. Why did they send me so far and so lonely? Up where the moors spread and grey rocks are piled? Men are hard-hearted, and kind angels only watch over the steps of a poor orphan child. I'm not going to go through the entire poem. Just I'll read a few more lines. Yet distant and soft, the night breeze is blowing. Clouds there are none, and clear stars beam mild. God in his mercy, protection is showing, comfort and hope to the poor orphan child. Heaven is a home, and a rest will not fail me. God is a friend to the poor orphan child. So I think this sort of strikes the note to what we are to expect regarding the life of Jane. The desolate orphan child who has been shunned because she belongs to the lower social order. And this is clearly stated when she hears in the line which are sung by Bessie that men are hard hearted. So the world created by men is a world which is not for Jane. And she is banished to the lonely moors and the grey rock, which resonate with her miserable condition. She becomes aware of the social world of hierarchies and class barriers, which isolate her, and that is why she seeks comfort in the natural world. So, the hope which is projected in the lines that we have just now discussed, clouds there are none, and clear star beam bright. So, this talks of a higher order where man cannot impose his right, a world where she will find comfort, security, and a homecoming. There are many scholars and writers, if you go through them, you will find that this conformity of Jane has been discussed. Her conformity to the external environment is because she strives to find a harmonious balance within the wildness of nature as she seeks to escape the confines of the Victorian society. Jane, she returns to the natural world time and again when seeking to liberate herself and liberate herself from the hardships and the dictates of the society where she finds herself a misfit. To her, there is power in freedom. And since nature is free, it epitomizes that power which she seeks. So, again, going back to the text, if you remember the very beginning of the novel, memorable opening passage, it is, of course, a cheerless November wintry afternoon, and she is thinking of the walk and the effect of the walk on the fingers and the toes of a child. So this emotional climate of the child, her subjective feeling is reflected through nature. She is lonely, unloved. She takes refuge from this cold world where she feels unwanted by consoling herself, if you remember, with the book Bewick's History of British Birds. And there she loses herself in the images of the storm, the shipwreck, disaster, the Arctic desolation, and sorry, and the Arctic desolation, the Alpine heights. So these images seem to express her own bewildered sense of life, and they correspond with her desolate, deprived condition at the homes of the Reeds, where we have seen how she suffers from complete isolation and a sort of physical and moral oppression. Later, she's very happy to leave Gateshead. And on a raw and cold wintry morning, with hardly any regrets, she starts her lonely journey into an unknown world. And this world is replete with the sounds of the wild wind rushing among the trees. And this is what lulls her to sleep, gives her a sense of comfort until she reaches her second destination, that is Lowood. Rain, wind, darkness, they fill the air as she enters the door to a place where she will be confined for the next 8 years of her life. Now, when we meet her at Lowood, we find that her burden of misery is lightened because she finds a friend in Helen Burns. And Jane gradually develops a sort of attachment in spite of all the privations of Lowood. We are introduced to Mr. Brocklehurst, if you remember, and how he rules with a dictatorial hand, imposing what he feels is relevant to liberate the spirit, so that human deprivation like hunger and starvation, they are acceptable because according to him, they seem to hone or they seem to help the spirit become a better person. So during her stay in Lowood, you find gradually the season changes, and so does Jane Eyre. She is influenced here by Miss Temple, who has provided her with the much needed love and care required for the nourishment of her body and soul. And gradually, the lonely soul of Jane Eyre gains a place of her own as winter gives way to spring. And the barren flower beds around Lowood strive to put up an appearance. So sometimes when she looks at the world, at nature around her on a sunny day, it all seems so pleasant and so genial. She finds a greenness which grows over the brown beds. And this suggests the hope which she feels has traversed at night and left in the morning with traces of a bright and better future. So through nature, she is always also on the verge of expectation of a better future. Now, as she settles down, she gradually matures. That hunger for companionship that is meted by the people she comes across, and she is endowed with a sense of liberty, also a kind of pleasure which she enjoys when she looks at the beauty of nature, the vegetation around her which has matured like her with vigor, and she feels that Lowood is losing its stresses, opening it for Jane Eyre to come and embrace it. There is a riot of colors as the flowers bloom in the golden sunshine, and Jane spends hours in the lap of nature. Ironically, at this time, if you remember, the orphan was waging a battle with death and disease. But for Jane, again, this little heaven that she has created, this is short-lived. and the stability of her life is once again compromised. Her friend Helen Bourne, she dies. Miss Temple also leaves, exposing Jane once again to the tumult which is there within her when she longs for real knowledge of life, when she seeks to leave the confined world of Lowood, and she desires to surmount the bleak peaks on the horizon, as she feels herself limited and imprisoned by the boundary of rock and the heath. So here you will find that Charlotte Bronte, she uses these antithetical images to present the contrary states. And this is, of course, akin to the Blakean vision. If you remember, Blake, he writes in the books of the songs, book of songs, the songs of innocence and the songs of experience. I think you all have read that, where the contrasted elements are presented as a single design. So the first part gives us an idea about how the imaginative vision is presented through the state of innocence, and the second through the challenges which are necessary to regain that state of innocence. So initially, though Jane lives in this Arcadian state of innocence, it is shattered by her experience of death, the death of her very close friend, Helen Burns. If you remember the pathetic scene when she's found with her arms around Helen Burns, who's found dead in the morning. So she decides to leave Lowood, and she's guided in her desire to attain liberty, since her journey into the realms of experience is not yet over. And that is why when she prays for liberty, you find that her prayers are scattered in the wind, because she still has that journey. And here you will find that both Emily and Charlotte Bronte, the sisters, they used nature imagery to portray the states of mind or the feelings of their characters, which we find in Jane Eyre. And Charlotte, she presents the pure and beautiful realm of nature in intimate and organic relationship with humanity as a whole. So Jane Eyre is discerning enough to understand and appreciate her relationship with the divine. And her progress follows not only her maturity or her realization. So nature reflects this state of Jane's mind. It reveals her awareness regarding the bond, very strong bond between man and the divine aspect of nature. And here, the spiritual growth of Jane can also be traced, as she recognizes the embodiment of the omnipotent divine being in nature. And later on, again, we'll come across the time when she realizes and this faith is reinstated at this later stage, when she has to leave Thornfield and she's rendered homeless once more, alone in the strange place. Even at that point, Jane feels this creative power within her, which she feels at Lowood. And she appreciates the benign aspects of nature, which inspire and work on her imagination. And she projects that through her drawings, if you remember, where the work of her hand gives you a vivid description of the freely penciled houses, the trees, the picturesque rocks and the ruins, the groups of cattle, the sweet paintings of butterflies hovering over unblown roses, and birds picking at ripe cherries. So you have a wonderful picturesque description of nature as seen through the eyes of Jane, of wren nests enclosing pearl-like eggs. The selection of her subjects for her painting tell you about her intimate relationship with nature and also delineates her progress in education, her spiritual progress, which reveals her maturity and a sort of acceptance to her condition. So we will find that once the absence of the calm and stable presence of Helen Burns and also Miss Temple is no longer there to influence Jane, she relinquishes her uneventful life at Lowood and seeks newer pastures. Now, this is a recurrent theme which you find that time and again she rejects that stagnation and she tries to relive her world through her decision and through the way she looks at things. She's never confined by the grandeur or the artificial life of the either the manor or the so-called security at Lowood, where she is also teaching as a governess for some time. So this compels her to take on the job of a governess at Thornfield, and she leaves her familiar shelter of Lowood, where she's of course she has been exposed to a world of both joy and sorrow. Now we come to the third section in her life, where she enters into the portals of Thornfield, and as the name suggests, here thorn and field, they give you an idea about both the harsh and the genial aspects of nature. As a sunlit scene of grove, pasture, green fields, they welcome her. Her stay at Thornfield, before, of course, the arrival of Mr. Rochester, is bereft of any emotional or physical upheaval. Because when she goes for this winter afternoon walk and she looks at nature, where nature in this delightful wintry solitude is in a repose, it is leafless, there is no breath of air, no sound, and no rustle of the holly or even the evergreen trees. All around her there is a stillness, and nature is also still, like the white worn stones which pave the path. And it is as if nature again is getting ready for the storm which is going to enter into Jane's life. It is the lull before the storm. And this we come to know at the sudden approach of Rochester's horse, which rudely interrupts this calm and peaceful picture of suspended life. And Rochester's meeting with Jane leaves a distinct impression on her. Again, you find that till this moment there was a sort of a superficial calm in her life. And once Rochester enters, she feels restless. And for the last time, she lingers outside Thornfield, which for her was the world of stagnation. And she looks at the sky. She looks at the midnight dark, at the fathomless depth, the measureless distance. She looks at the trembling stars that follow their course. And some inexplicable reason makes her heart tremble. Her veins glow when she views this nature. So gradually we find that she undergoes a dimension of experience and her vision broadens. At Thornfield, the skyline, it gives her a vision, tells her about her life, which is going to transcend the limits and reach a world which is untraveled so far. Her desire, you find that within Jane, this desire to enter into a region which is full of life, which she has seen and she has heard of but never seen. This desire to enter into a realm which is unexplored. This is incarnated in the well-traveled figure of Rochester, who enters into her life. And on one hand, he brings a sort of domestic confine into the world of Thornfield, a balance of home as well as a whiff of the great world which he has traveled. So he represents the desire of Jane for an active, worldly, expansive self, and also the impulse which is there within her to withdraw into a protective, idealized enclave. So this hope of securing a stable world, which we already mentioned, that desire to achieve a stable world is always there. And this is ignited on the occasion when Jane saves Rochester's life after having put out that fire in his room. Rochester's reaction leaves her sleepless, and the turbulence which is now within her is portrayed in her condition as she says that she tossed on a buoyant but unquiet sea, where billows of the waves of trouble, they rolled under the surges of joy. So amidst this mental turmoil and turbulence, she leaves to attend to Mrs. Reed, if you remember, who's on her deathbed. And when she returns, she is full of suppressed hope with a sense of burning impatience. It is, of course, affected by the dream that she has of Miss Ingram closing the gates of Thornfield against her. And the sky is a kind of mottled blue with the visible in certain gaps. And this promises her about a future which is unsettled. But then she sees, as it seems as if there is a fire lit, an altar burning behind its screen of marbled vigor. And this golden redness, it welcomes her. It speaks of Jane's ardent desire to be with her master. Of course, her wish is granted. And we find the time comes when Rochester proposes to her on a moonlit night. The garden, of course, is transformed into a paradise like state where you have a wonderful description of the sweet southern wood, the jasmine, the pink rose, and how they have yielded their fragrance to the evening. And it seems as if they are sacrificing their incense to heighten the pleasure of that beautiful evening. And she sees the trees which are laden with fruit. She can also hear the nightingale which is warbling in the woods. So throughout this moment, we have seen that Jane has resisted the naturalized hierarchies of a society. And in accordance with the romantic mode, which privileges the natural world, Charlotte Bronte, consistently depicts Jane's external environment as a vibrant and permanent presence, which is rich and which is laden with inescapable emotions. So, though interestingly, when she arrives at Thornfield and she is, if you remember, she is shown that lavish and extravagant chamber which she will occupy in her position of a governess. She's aware that this is a new beginning to her life. And there is a description of how the sun brightens up the little place as the sun streams through the window curtains. The natural sunlight heightens the aesthetic quality of the human world, of which she's going to be a resident. And it also suggests that Jane's natural environment will be affected and it will bring a change in her new social environment at Thornfield too. So at that moment, you remember that she compares this room at Thornfield with the room she has left at Lowood. And she realizes the difference between the two opposing environments, one reserved for the upper class and the other for the lower class. And Jane recognizes this division, this distinction, and she attempts to free herself from the confinement of her society's hierarchy by looking at the natural world for peace and for freedom. And you remember, she tells Mr. Rochester that she is a free human being and she seeks a liberty of her spirit. So this she can only achieve when she realizes the power of nature. And the conflict between the rigid Victorian social standards and the liberation towards a more natural order is explicit when Rochester expresses his love for Jane. You remember that Edenic bower? And interestingly, at this time, when Mr. Rochester is expressing his love for Jane, Jane is still a poor dependent. And Jane is a mere employee in the household of the master. So naturally, the union cannot take place because that social barrier has to be removed. And Rochester does not propose to her within the confines of Thornfield House. He proposes to her in that paradise-like environment because there are no superficial trappings to restrict their union. And there, at a point, they meet as equals. The garden basically frees them from the fetters of the social conventions. Yet, of course, as we know, they cannot be united because Charlotte Bronte is, of course, aware of the lurking threat of bigamy, as the invisible presence of Bertha Mason, the first wife of Mr. Rochester, makes the union of Jane and Rochester, unacceptable. So when Jane enters into the mansion again, then we have the Victorian world entering with her, where she confronts Mr. Fairfax, if you remember, and um, the presence of the pale and amazed Mr. Fairfax, who sees the master and the governess in an intimate position, is a hint of the unacceptability of this union. And here, nature too gives a warning, which comes in the shape of the old horse chestnut tree, which splits in two. This clearly indicates the separate lives that both the protagonists are to live in the ensuing days. So you remember that passage? It is a beautiful passage where Jane is. She can hear the chestnut tree groaning. It is writhing. It is projected as if it is in pain, and the wind roars in the laurel walk. And when the weather changes, she can hear the deep sound of the thunder as it crashes, the fierce and frequent lightning which strikes, which gleams, and then that cataract like rainfall which brings in the storm. And early the next morning, little Adelaide, she comes running to tell Jane that the great horse chestnut at the bottom of the garden has been struck by lightning and half of it has been split away. But interestingly, you need to remember that the roots are intact. So, this time of revelation of Mr. Rochester's feeling for Jane in this Edenic orchard on the midsummer eve, though it resonates a joyous Wordsworthian tone of life, where everything is, as Mr. Rochester says, everything is real, sweet, and pure. But this Eden is destroyed, and nature seeks to portend the end of their bliss by the terrible thunderstorm. So Jane contemplates about this failed union where she is removed from her paradise and darkness falls. The weather is inclement. So in the morning, when the chestnut tree is found at the bottom of their paradise, it is split and mangled. It is a forecast to Mr. Rochester's state when, after the fire at Ferndean Manor, he is struck, he is blind and maimed. He resembles this chestnut. And when he meets her at Ferndean Hall later, at the end of the novel, you remember, he says that he was no better than that old lightning struck chestnut tree in Thornfield. So at that moment, in spite of that warning by that omen by nature, the ominous warning that is given, the marriage is all set to take place, but you again have the unnatural appearance of the prophetic moon, which portends the disastrous marriage ceremony. And the storm now breaks over her at the altar. So here you have again the description of the moon, which appeared momentarily in a section of the sky, and the disk is blood red and half overcast. So the moon seems to throw a bewildered glance at Jane, and then the moon buries herself again in the deep drift of the cloud, as if unwilling to see the terrible end of that Edenic bliss to which Jane had been earlier subject to. So ultimately, again, we find Jane is compelled to leave Thornfield as she reverts back to becoming that cold, isolated, solitary girl where her hopes lay crushed and dead, as if a Christmas frost had come at midsummer, or a white storm had destroyed the blossoms in June. So, as she is forced to distance herself from her master, and she's alone in a desolate condition, rendered homeless, at that point she realizes the cosmic harmony where heaven, earth, and man are a part of the universe. And she acknowledges the serenity of the night and the presence of the Almighty as she feels safe when she has to spend that night out in the open underneath the sky, the stars. And she acknowledges that God is everywhere, God is omnipotent, God is omnipresent. She can feel the presence. And that the way he works are on the grandest scale. And she looks up at the unclouded night sky and she realizes the world which wheels their silent course, where she reads the clearest identification of the infinite presence of the omnipotent God. And when she is in this secluded place out in the open, in the lap of nature, she finds solace in the arms of Mother Nature, who accepts her dejected and completely forlorn, abandoned child without any question. Mother Nature bestows succor and a balm to her weary soul. And we find Jane clings to her in her misery, drawing the life spirit to continue her lonely journey again. So at that moment, she feels that nature is benign, nature is good, in contrast to the world of man. Again, you remember the ballad of Desi. And she understands that nature loves her, though she was an outcast. And she could only anticipate from the world of men mistrust, rejection, insult. So she clings to Mother Nature with filial fondness. And she rests that night. She knows she will be a guest. She will be a child to the mother who will lodge her, who will take care of her, who will provide her with security and comfort without money, without any price. So we find again a change in the scene when the comfortable green pastoral landscape of Thornfield gives way as she moves on in her journey, where not only is she gaining maturity, but a kind of spiritual growth, and she faces the harsh reality of Morton with its downtrodden and wasted grounds. So we find that throughout Charlotte Bronte is recreating the moods and the passion, and she's projecting the pain of loneliness through the association of Jane with the time and the place and the various aspects of nature. Jane's sensitivity towards nature, where she alludes to the romantic fervor, and we look at the anxiety of a 18-year-old for whom nature is a treasury of delight, where nature is also imparting a lesson, where nature is testing the endurance. And when Jane is on the verge of collapse, she gains admittance to her new abode. She finds a home at Moor House, where she regains her dignity, her power, her health from the surrounding hill country. So we find that nature, as always, for Jane is full of promises. But interestingly, you will find that not everyone is moved easily by her allure, by the impact of nature. And here, when she meets her newfound cousins, Mary and Diana, and Saint John Rivers. So Jane realizes that Saint John Rivers is appreciative of that rugged charm of the hills, but he fights to remain practical and sensible in spite of all the charm and beauty which surrounds him, because he portrays the Victorian spirit, where his sensibility restrains him from committing either to its charm or enjoying the benefit of roaming on the moors for the sake of their soothing silence, or the thousand peaceful delights which Jane experiences, which Jane feels that nature could yield. All around, Jane finds nature bountiful and ripe, but for St. John Rivers, he does not respond to nature. So it is amply clear that St. John Rivers is not the right mate for Jane, who considers St. John Rivers as a person who's as cold as an iceberg, if you remember her phrase. So Jane again undergoes a sort of a magical transformation. She delights in the companionship of Mary and Diana, and this bonding enhances this bonding not only with the two sisters, but also with nature, enhances her state of well-being, and she enjoys the pure and sweet sources of pleasure derived from nature. So she forms an attachment not only with her kindred soul sisters, but this attachment also makes her full of the zest for life which she regains. And then later she takes on the post of a school mistress, if you remember, in a breezy mountain nook in the healthy heart of England. So she reiterates in a truly Wordsworthian vein that the romantic and the transcendental viewpoint, when she says that nature teaches more than the spiritual truth that any church can impart. And that is why Jane can confidently reject the proposal of St. John Rivers, because she realizes that she cannot survive uprooted and loveless in that idyllic settlement of that foreign world. So the story culminates, and she responds to a call, if you remember, the call which is brought by the hills when she is flustered and she does not know what decision she needs to take. And at that moment, her spirit reaches out to Rochester, because, again, they are akin to each other in spirit and in soul. So when Rochester calls out to her from Ferndean Manor, she can hear the echo of his call. Though you remember that Ferndean Manor is situated in a desolate spot, buried deep in the woods, far from human habitat. And when Jane enters into the world, it is a completely new world. Rochester is, of course, happy, and Jane leads. I am in a way compressing the end. So we come to a point when Jane is leading Rochester out of that wet and wild wood into the cheerful fields where flowers and edges, they look refreshed by the night's penetrating rain. So the rain is successful in cleansing away the pain, the suffering, and ushering in a new life for both Jane and Mr. Rochester as they enter into the Arcadian woods called home. So their love, which has its origin in the world of the spirit, you remember that when they confront each other initially, and Jane is taken aback by the sudden appearance of Mr. Rochester and feels that it is an outwardly appearance. And even Rochester later he confesses that when he had first seen Jane, he felt that she belonged to a world of the spirits. So when she returns to Ferndean, then again Rochester cannot accept that she is a reality. So Jane is projected again and again as a denizen of the romantic fairy world. She is a child of nature. She is a spirit, an elf, and a thing made of elements. So that is why ultimately the culmination of their relation in marriage, we find that nature is destroyed because passivity is an esteem, it is a quality of nature. Whenever there is passivity, either in nature or in the woman, and there is a denial of activity in nature and in life, then women and nature become degraded and become the natural victim of the ecological problem which we find in the Victorian period. So, this prophetic power of nature reveals to Jane her destination, and you find that there is this recuperative power of nature which instills within Jane a confidence, a renewed hope, um, and she, like Eve, she has ventured out of that forbidden garden. She again regains her paradise. So, Charlotte Bronte, in her novel, conceptualizes a natural environment, a space for withdrawal from the complexities of society. We find this again reflected in Wuthering Heights also, if you have read that, and in the works of Anne Bronte also. So here you will find that basically it is a kind of contrast to that urban industrial world and the pastoral world, where the primal laws of nature establish themselves. So I come to the end of my lecture, and I would just like to end by saying that this Victorian novel, uh, it gives you an idea about the issues related to environment, especially during this Victorian period, and how nature is necessary for the sustenance of human life. So thank you. And
Thank,
yes, I hope I have in some way given you information which you could process and understand.
yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam, for this presentation. I now welcome questions and comments from the members of the audience. If you have any query or any doubt, you can ask her,
Yes, please.
or you may send your questions in the chat box.
Okay, so we have a question. Techniques used in Jane Eyre. Well, I am not very certain as to what techniques you are talking about, but when we read Jane Eyre, you will find that um, there are so many different ways where Jane Eyre is projected. On one hand, it is narrated in the with first hand narrator. Okay, so here you will find that the autobiographical mode is being used because we find autobiographical elements in the text that we are reading, and we will also find that there are reflections of what Charlotte Bronte has gone through in her life, and her projections of the way she looks at life, the way she has experienced life, the way she has projected her life through the novel that she has written. So I think yes, we can talk about the various elements which we find in the novel, the elements like the Gothic, the elements which give you an idea about a kind of the supernatural world which also resides. So these are again a way of looking, because see, Jane Eyre is a novel which has been written and discussed so many times. You have had in-depth scholarly writings and varied ways of looking at it. So now, yes, I can come to the second question. Novel comment on the
Yes.
position of, yes, women. That is a very, very interesting question. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So, position of women. Now, if you remember that Charlotte, we need to talk about the life of Charlotte Bronte and her sisters. Charlotte Bronte worked as a governess. And during that time, during the 19th century, you'll find that even when they are writing, they are using masculine pseudonyms. That itself tells you a great deal about the position of women. It tells you the fact that women, when they were writing, they because Emily and Charlotte were writing on themes which were considered masculine, which were not considered feminine. That is why they had to take the recourse of this pseudonyms. And regarding the economic position, you will find that the in the Victorian period, the only job which was there for the women, either they needed to get married, or if they did not find an eligible bachelor for a secure life, governess was the only profession that they could choose. And we find that all her sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Agnes, they have worked as a governess. And there again, you find that kind of social, a sort of a denigration when Jane, she enters into that the room where Miss Ingram, she is parting the entire so-called societal people, the people who belong to the upper rungs of the society. They have come together at Thornfield, and there, when she enters, then she is neglected, she is ignored, and they look down upon her because they do not consider her as a part of their society. So she is always, the governess is always relegated to the margin, and she has to suffer. And that is why you find that separation or segregation from the society, because it is based on the economic deprivation that is reflected in the novels which Charlotte Bronte has written. You will find that in Villette also. You will find that in Shirley, and of course in Jane Eyre we find that. So I hope I mean that gives you some idea about the position of women. Ultimately, we find that even Jane Eyre, she gets married to Rochester. So that is a sort of a statement of the position of women in the Victorian period. And even in real life, Charlotte Bronte was compelled to get married to the parson, even though she did not love him. But it was again a sort of a compromise. So This gives you an idea that women were not independent, even though Jane keeps again and again talking about that independent spirit which she strives to achieve and to establish. Am I clear? Okay.
Thank you, madam. There is another question from Sanchita Das.
Yes.
Ma'am, please explain the themes in Jane Eyre.
Well, in Jane Eyre, you have plenty of themes. You have the theme of the how there is a kind of a segregation between the romantic world and the Victorian world. You have the theme of nature. Here again, I would like to talk about the symbols which have been projected again and again. I mean, of course, since the time is short, I could not talk about, but here one very interesting theme is how the four elements of nature have been projected. Like we know that the four elements of nature are fire, water, air, and earth. So when Jane Eyre is described, she is described as an airy spirit belonging to the ethereal world. And that is why she flits from one place to another till she achieves what she desires. And then fire. You remember that in Thornfield, when Rochester is he's engulfed in that fire, and it is Jane who helps him to survive. And again, when she is in Moor House, when she returns, she is told about the disastrous fire which has destroyed Thornfield. So fire plays a very important part because it is again acting as a symbol of cleansing, and it acts as a symbol of cleansing because it is required for Rochester's union with Jane Eyre. Rochester, who has led, in a way, a kind of corrupt life, you might say, where he has indulged in his adventurous lifestyle. So that needed a kind of cleansing. So, I mean, that is another aspect. Then, of course, you have the rivers who give you an idea about the aspect of water, how that the rivers, how they cleanse her soul, and ultimately they are the ones who give her that economic stability which is missing in her life when she gets the news that her uncle has died and has bestowed upon her an inheritance. This inheritance is necessary for her to gain equal footing with Rochester, and so it is in the House of the Rivers that she acquires the sense of independence, economic independence, and also a liberation of her spirit when she gets the call from Rochester and she goes to Ferndean Hall, right? So another theme, of course, is if you remember that there is a hint of the colonial uh, past, where Rochester's story gives you an idea that he had led a sort of a depraved life. He had led a life which gave him a lot of pain and sorrow because his father had been ambitious, and his father, instead of giving the wealth to his second son, dividing it equally between the two sons, the inheritance is only given to the eldest son. And Rochester is deprived because for him, the father has ambitious plans of getting him married to the daughter of a colonial planter, and how that ultimately fails. So, this aspect of the colonial past, this in a way destroys Rochester, but in contradiction, you will find that it helps Jane because the wealth accumulated by her relative from that colonial world gives her that economic stability which she desires. So, yes, you will also find the Gothic themes here. which I think when I talk about Bertha's role in the novel, which is another question by Sangeeta. Yes, thank you, Sangeeta. So I think that I will combine the two so that you get an answer for this question. Bertha's role is, of course, quite important here because you remember that again we come back to the presence of Bertha, who's a secret. Now, Bertha gives you an idea about this aspect of the past of Rochester's life, where Bertha expresses the symbol of the sexuality, overt sexuality, which is present in the life of Rochester. And this overt sexuality needs to be destroyed. So when this sexuality is kept under cover, Bertha is hidden. And ultimately, when she comes out at night, so on one hand, we have Bertha, who is also giving us an idea about that Gothic atmosphere. She's creating that Gothic atmosphere because you remember that when Jane, I mean, see, nature always gives her a beautiful, peaceful, and harmonic life. But when she enters into the confines of a manor, the manor which projects a kind of life which is mysterious, which is full of eerie sounds, which is full of the mad laugh of Bertha, which she feels that it is Grace Poole who is responsible for this, the mysterious sounds emanating from the confines of the room hidden in the second story. So, on one hand, Bertha gives you an idea about that Gothic world, about the world of supernaturalism, which terrifies Jane on one hand when she comes across the demonic figure twice. And she also is aware that on the eve of her marriage, she confronts this demonic figure, a huge masculine figure with red bloodshot eyes, and how it tears apart the veil. So there again, Bertha is symbolizing the the union of Rochester and Jane, which is not supposed to take place because Rochester is still entrapped in a world of bigamy, in a world of sexual deprivative life which he had led earlier. So the release of Rochester comes through that fire which destroys Thornfield, the fire which destroys Rochester in a way, and makes him aware of coming up with a new life where the presence of Bertha is no longer felt. So Bertha gives you both the elements of the Gothic world, the supernatural world, the world which is a threat to Jane Austen's peaceful world, and at the same time, it exposes the Victorian concepts of how overt sexuality has to be confined and it has to be relegated to the background. It cannot come out in the open, and that is why Jane cannot get married to Rochester, and only the death of Bertha, who flings herself, means in a way, Rochester is being purified by the death of Bertha. So, yes. So, I think you have got some idea about Bertha's role, why she is important. She gives you an idea about the colonial world, which was very much present in the Victorian times, and how people profited, how Rochester's father and brother, they had thought of profiting from this marriage at the cost of the happiness and the sort of mental um, uh, instability, or you might say mental disharmony in the mind of Rochester, which stays throughout till he meets Jane. So Bertha explores all that is wild, which is uncontained, which is unacceptable, and which is volatile, and which has to conform to the Victorian norms. So I hope it is clear to you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Sangeeta.
Madam, there is other question in the chat box from
Yes,
Sultana Begum.
yes,
Ma'am, please say something about the plot twists in Jane Eyre.
right, right. So regarding the plot twist, now if we look at it in a very simplified manner, we'll find that there are basically four um, complete divisions of a life, four to five. First, you have Jane at Lowood, where Jane realizes the pain of isolation, the pain of being a dependent, the pain of the economic security, which she does not have and she longs for. And that is the first time when she comes in contact with the harmonic presence of nature. And you will find interestingly when the doctor comes, when she is suffering from this nervous breakdown, and the doctor comes and asks her what she requires, what she desires, whether she would like to be poor. At that very young age, she's aware of this disparity, economic disparity, which becomes a constraint to progress and development in life. And that is why she says that she is not willing to lead a poor life, and she accepts education. She accepts the fact that she needs to be educated in order to lead a better life. So from that state of isolation at I'm sorry, at Gateshead, she is taken to Lowood. And Lowood, on one hand, she is given education, her spirit also becomes broader, where she converses with, if you remember, Helen Burns. And Helen Burns' complete acceptance and belief in the God, in the her Christian belief in heaven, that is questioned by Jane Eyre. And Jane Eyre, at that even at that moment, she is not quite um, acceptable, or she does not quite accept the presence of this Christian God, because she questions as to where is this God, what is this God, is there really a place called heaven. So these questions give us an idea that her spirit is still not in harmony with the divine being. And that is why you find that her restless spirit, which is projected throughout the novel, that comes to a sort of a temporary break under the influence of Helen Burns and also Miss Temple. But once both of them, they go away, their influence disappears from their life, what happens is then that sense of restlessness again reoccurs. So again you find there is a turn in her life. And from Lowood, what she is taking is, she has come to a sort of maturity, because she has what she had felt in Gateshead, that that isolation, that deprivation of human company, that is completely erased in Lowood, where she accepts her loneliness, or she is quite in harmony with being with herself amidst nature. So here there is a projection of her development through education, and also there is a kind of spiritual progress in her, where she becomes a bit more patient, more enduring. These qualities are inculcated in her. And then again, when there is a twist and she goes to Thornfield Manor, there you find that the events which take place not only make her aware of her attraction to Mr. Rochester, she is at that same time aware that she belongs to a class which is much lower to the class which Mr. Rochester belongs. But she does not accept that, because you remember that when she is introduced to the housekeeper, initially she feels that she is the landlady, but when she understands that she's just a housekeeper, then she is relieved and she feels that they are equals. So, this sense is very much there in Jane Eyre throughout, that she needs to be equal with the person at hand. So, when she comes across the fact that Rochester is, of course, a person who lavishes her with the pearl set jewelry, and he is bent upon buying her all the trousseau for her marriage. She fights him. She says that she's not happy because for her material good, that has no value for her. And then she knows that in spite of her love for Rochester, she needs to go away from his life because she cannot be a part of the bigamy, because she knows that she might be just a mistress. She looks back at the life of Rochester, at the mistresses that he had. So that again gives you an idea about the social norms which are there, which unconsciously Jane is also aware of. So on one hand, this economic deprivation that she becomes aware of, and also what the society demands. And so she leaves Thornfield, and you have her going into the Moor house, isn't it? There you find that she finds her own. Not only she is accepted when she becomes friends with Diana and with Mary, she's accepted as an equal because of the education which she has already acquired, because of the intelligence which she converses with. And again later, when she's endowed with that economical inheritance. And after that, she goes back to Ferndean Hall because now she's at par with Rochester. That now they are equals in a way, that she is an independent woman. If you remember, when she meets Rochester, she at Ferndean, and she tells him that she is now an equal because she is a person who has inherited a lot of money, and she is acting as a crutch to Rochester. So physically also you will find that though she knows that she is no longer employee, or she is no longer in a degraded position, she is an equal. But because she marries Rochester for love, and because they are kindred spirit in a way, the fact that she acts as his crutch, that sort of a physical dependence on her, it provides her with a satisfaction that now she is the protectress. She is the person who can give security and protection to Rochester, which earlier Rochester was trying to give to her, and she was trying to resist because she, as she has already said again and again, is an independent spirit. So I hope, yes, you have understood about the different turns and twists and how they are related to the different states of her life.
Thank you, ma'am. There is a question from Shongita Saha. Can we say that Bertha is Jane's alter ego?
Yes. Thank you, Shangita. Yes, of course. Bertha is also, I mean, that is one point that I need to explain. Bertha is Jane's alter ego, because what does Bertha signify? Bertha signifies certain masculine qualities. Bertha signifies certain sensual qualities. Bertha signifies certain qualities which can be termed as violent, which can be termed as restless, which is unconventional, I think. Yes, and you will find that within Jane, these qualities are also latent. They are very much there within her. And time and again, she has to fight against these emotions, these volatile feelings which are there. And we will find that when she's at Lowood, these feelings which are there are in a way tamed for a temporary period of time. But that restlessness, which is an innate quality of Jane, that is there, and that is again explored when she is at Thornfield, and she falls in love with Rochester. You will find that this love is something which is very passionate, and this talks about the passion which the image of Bertha generates, the violence which is also there. So Bertha talks about this latent sexuality which is there both in Rochester and in Jane, and which Jane tries to curb again and again. So when at the end, when she realizes that she cannot get married to Rochester, you find that there is a conflict within her where she is more or less happy at the idea that if she stays with Rochester, at least she will be able to stay with her beloved. And she nearly gives in to this very passionate ideal of love, which is based on the sensuality, on the passion, on a very heightened emotion, which Bertha signifies. But again, Jane needs to come up with this voice of nature, which is again the voice of reason. And this voice tells her to flee temptation. And she flees temptation because she knows that she's on the verge of giving in to temptation. And this temptation is what Bertha also projects. So again that cleansing of this idea of that sensual, passionate, turbulent self which is there within Jane, that needs to be cleansed. And so the fire, which is again we know an agent of purification, that is brought in by Charlotte. And that the huge fire which ravages the mansion of Thornfield gives us a changed atmosphere where Bertha, or that violent and volatile self of Jane, is now brought within control, and she goes to Ferndale Hall, and she realizes that now she is in a better position. She is now in control of her emotions, and she is a better partner to Rochester. So I hope that has in some way cleared your doubts.
Thank you, madam. There is
Madam,
no other question in the chat box.
Madam,
Yes,
madam,
yes.
I have a question, please.
Yes.
Madam, can we say that Mr. Rochester is somehow or other could be termed as something like hypocrite, because he time and again hides the women, that is called the Mad Women in the Attic, the famous essay by
Yes.
Gilbert and Goober.
Goober and Gilbert, yeah.
Yes. So can we say that he is somehow he's trying to project himself to be something, to be innocent, someone who has suffered much in his life, and he rightly deserves Jane Eyre to be his mistress. And on the other hand, at the cost of the happiness, at the life of Bertha Mason, or someone like Antoinette, that we can find while reading White Sargassy, because after reading White Sargassy, the kind of multi-dimensions multi-dimensional interpretations of Jane Eyre opens up.
Yeah.
Because here in Jane Eyre, we find that some kind of only there is focus between the love, or the love section between Rochester and Jane Eyre. But when we read deeply, we can find that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There is something more under the water. So, ma'am, can we say that Rochester is a hypocrite? My first question.
Yeah, I mean, of course, one thing which you have very clearly put up is that the more we read about Jane Eyre, you have plenty and myriads of explanations, and the more we explore, we get different viewpoints. That is, of course, there. Yes, and when you are calling, you can call Rochester a sort of hypocrite. Now, one thing I would like to tell you is that if you look at the works of the sisters, basically they are writing at a time when the Victorian conventions and the Victorian compromise is very much there, isn't it? If you look at Emily Bronte's presentation of Heathcliff. Again, you find that he is a character who does not conform in any way to any of the social norms. So, keeping that in mind, when we come to Rochester, you find that he is also created. He is a sort of a Byronic hero who does not obey any of the conventional norms, and so we find that that Rochester is basically trying to. He is also trying to find the real self in a way. So, like Jane, there is a sort of a journey for Rochester too. And Rochester, who has been projected in the novel as first, I mean, when we are introduced to him, he's a very mysterious, a masculine person. And interestingly, you will find that when Jane is there present with all the ladies and gentlemen, and they are having a nice time, then Rochester comes in guise of a gypsy woman. So there again you find that the fact that he is coming in the guise of a gypsy woman is trying to tell you that there is some kind of conflict within Rochester too, and he is taken on this disguise of a woman gypsy. He could easily have come as a man gypsy, isn't it? But he comes as a woman gypsy. So there is this conflict within him where he knows that what he has done, or what the kind of life that he has led, that projects the masculine, you might say, patriarchal norms which are there, and he does not accept that. So you have this subtle feminine projection of himself, and he comes to terms later on. I mean, in a way, basically you will find that it is Charlotte who brings him to a position where he is no longer the Rochester he was earlier, that he is no longer a person, because now he is physically also maimed. Not only he has undergone a spiritual journey, where he earlier you find that he is very, very egoistic, and he is a person who's so full of pride. But at the end, you remember the final lines that he says, that he thanks God. He thanks God for bringing back Jane to him. And this again is a statement that he is accepting, he is surrendering to the divine sublime. And for that, he has to undergo this terrible journey of trials and tribulation to cast off his previous image of a person with mistress, of a person who was leading a luxurious, tempestuous life. And now he has come to a point where for him seclusion and isolation brings happiness. So, I mean, you will find that this is, again, there is a kind of poetic justice also, where he is struck blind because of the society which he had inhabited earlier, the society which was society of luxury, of lavishness, of sensuality and sexuality. So now he is struck blind, and at the very end, the last chapter, if you remember, there you will find there is an explanation by Jane that gradually one eye of Rochester has gained partial eyesight. So this tells you about that sense of enlightenment, which is also in Rochester at the end.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Madam, there is another question from Shogata Mondal. Is Jane Eyre a feminist novel?
Yes, of course. I mean, we have so many works discussing Jane Eyre as a feminist novel. You have so many scholars writing about this. So Jane Eyre as a feminist novel, I think we have more or less discussed some of the points already, where you find that Jane Eyre is throughout trying to find her own position in the society, that she is not going to be subservient to anyone, be it Rochester, be it St. John Rivers. Because you remember that St. John Rivers also provides, he is trying to project an alternate to the life that she wants to lead. And he is trying to project a kind of a missionary zeal which he feels is there within her. So I mean, she is not happy with that. She is trying to find her own independent place. Independent in the sense, I'm not just talking about economic independence, because you remember that she was working as a school mistress and she was teaching the rural girls there. She was quite happy after the initial hitch. Later on, she was quite happy when she could enlighten their mind. So, in a way, you find that Jane is throughout trying to create her own position as she feels is necessary. So, economically, of course, Charlotte gives her that inheritance and she becomes an equal to Rochester, and that is why for her it is easy to accept the position of a companion to Rochester. And you will also find that spiritually, ideologically, in the aspect of through the aspect of education, she has created an enlightened version of herself. So I mean, at this juncture, we will have to remember that this is, of course, the Victorian period, where the females were dominated by the patriarchal order. And that is why Charlotte initially used that pseudonym, because she knew this projection of a woman, of a girl child, you might say, in creating a world in spite of all kinds of patriarchal, social, economic, societal deprivation, is indeed a success story of any female. So, in a nutshell, I think I have just touched upon.
Thank you, madam. There is no other question in the chat box.
So, thank you very much. I mean, it was a wonderful interactive session, and thank you. Your
Yes, ma'am.
students are wonderful. They are really interested in literature. That is something I appreciate.
But there is a poor attendance, ma'am.
No, that is fine, because see, today is Sunday. So Sunday is basically a day where people relax and enjoy. The entire weekday are days where you need to fight for sustenance, like Jane. So that is
Yes, ma'am.
no problem.
Yes, ma'am. Now, on behalf of the organizers, I seize the occasion to thank today's speaker, Dr. Monisha Sarkar Sinha, for giving us an opportunity to listen to her. It was really a fabulous session, and I would like to inform you that you all that tomorrow Confab 2021 will have its 7th lecture. Sri Dibbobibha Rai, Assistant Professor of English, Malda Women's College, Malda, is going to be with us tomorrow, and we will talk about William Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. So I hope to have your presence tomorrow at the same time, 11 a.m. So here we end the session.
Thank you,
Thank you, madam. Thank you,
so
everyone.
much. And
Take
thank you,
care and
everyone,
stay safe.
for your patience listening. Thank you so much.
Hmm.